Welcome to Season 2 of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. This season, we return to the archives with a wider lens and a deeper reach. 6 new full-length episodes continue the search for the overlooked, the buried, and the half-remembered. These are the traces left behind by time and progress. They're records of how people built, broke, and rebuilt the world around them. Each journey begins in the present, but it always leads somewhere older, through the layers of a place, the marks of its making, and the echoes that remain when the noise fades. What we uncover are not just artifacts of history, but reflections of ourselves, our patterns, our ambitions, our capacity to forget and to rediscover. The Field Guide has always been about more than ruins and lost history. It's about continuity, the way memory endures in the texture of stone, the shape of a road, or the flicker of light on an old photograph. It's also about the stories we choose to tell and those we allow to fade. Every act of remembrance reveals something about who we are as a society and what we value as a people. What we preserve and what we overlook both speak to our character. The Field Guide listens for those echoes, in the margins and beneath the noise, tracing how memory survives through time. These aren't just accounts of what once was, but reflections of how we understand ourselves in the present, how we build meaning from what remains. Season 2 invites you to listen closer, to see what survives in the silence between stories. Let's begin Season 2 and open the next file in the archive. Initiating broadcast. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 7 of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm your host and creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer. Thanks for listening. In this episode of the Field Guide, we're going to talk about the night, darkness, and how it's influenced our history, our lives, and our myths. So let's begin. Act 1, Connections. This episode is the companion to my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, History Hidden in Darkness. But it's also a standalone episode exploring how the dark has influenced our history and our stories. This book is the confluence of so many things that orbit Restoration Obscura: history, the night sky, photography, and storytelling and advocacy. The story of Field Guide to the Night begins long before I knew I was writing a book. It began in childhood, when darkness carried imagination, even excitement. It was the place when all the exciting things in movies happened. I remember riding my bike on quiet summer streets in upstate New York beneath those heavy Cobra Head streetlights. They cast small, perfect pools of sodium glow, each one separated by a stretch of shadow. Pedaling through those intervals, you could feel the temperature drop, the air thicken, the silence take hold. The shadows carried their own wonder, small, self-contained portals to the other side of light. For a child, they were more than gaps in light. They were spaces that felt alive. Sometimes the night was festive, filled with sounds and echoes that turned familiar streets into something otherworldly. The 4th of July was one of those nights. Fireworks broke open the sky, shattering silence with a percussion that rolled through the dark like distant thunder. We rode our bikes through the echoes, sparks falling overhead, the sound bouncing from one house front to another. Shadows stretched and twisted across porches and fences with every flash, then collapsed back into darkness as the sky reset. The air smelled of smoke and spent powder, the residue of light clinging to the night. The haze was blue. The light seemed like you could push it like you would water. For a short while, the neighborhood felt suspended. The stoplights at the end of the street blinked against an empty road, the colors throwing fat beams into the night. Dogs barked, then fell silent. Neighbors gathered on stoops, their faces briefly illuminated in red, then white, then green. Those nights taught me something I didn't yet have words for. Darkness is what makes the brief flare of light feel larger than it is. Without the long stretch of shadow, the comet's tail, a match struck, or even the glow of a single porch bulb would pass unnoticed. It was the surrounding dark that gave them shape, that made the smallest light radiate with a halo surrounding it. Without the night to hold it, a firework would be just chemistry. Against that wide black backdrop, it became the DNA of childhood memories. This is where I developed my love of abandoned places. The silence between bursts carried its own kind of charge. You could stand still and sense the neighborhood as if it had slipped into another time. Empty lots, boarded windows, forgotten corners of town, they all carried the same feeling. At night, they became more than they were in daylight. Danger, maybe, but excitement and mystery as well. They were layered with history, steeped in canopsia. The eerie, unsettling atmosphere of a place once full of life, now emptied of its people. What I didn't know then is that people have always seen night this way. Across cultures, darkness has been more than emptiness. It's been haunted, storied, and alive. The same hush that fell on my childhood street echoed in ancient towns when lamps went out, in villages where fires burned low, in cities that dimmed themselves by decree during blackouts. That continuity, the sense that the silence of night connects us across centuries, was what I would come to write about later. Music carried differently after dark. A song drifting from a neighbor's window meant something else entirely than it did by day. It filled the air with atmosphere. There were songs that I'd only listen to at night because they felt wrong during the day. Some songs only truly lived at night because night gave them room to breathe. It held you in place. But the moment that defined my relationship with darkness came one evening in the 1980s. After dinner, my father told me we were taking a ride. He said Halley's Comet had returned, and we might just see it if we drove away from the glow of town. We left behind the traffic lights, the corner stores, the last porch bulbs, and drove out past the woods that surrounded town into the open spaces with larger, darker skies, out North Lake Avenue, and onto the broad-shouldered Route 7. We pulled off a dirt patch at the farthest point north on the reservoir. The horizon stretched clear, and above it, a faint thumbprint of light hovered in the dark. "That's it," my father said. "Halley's Comet. You'll be an old man the next time it comes back." I didn't yet understand what 75 years really meant, how quickly time would move when the world was responsibility and office lights. There was no way to prepare for the perception of time moving faster the older you were. To a child, the scale of time beyond a school year, beyond the next summer, was impossible to hold. At that age, you're just looking for the next distraction. You think you're invincible. I couldn't imagine my father gone, or myself aged into an old man. The idea that the comet would return long after we had changed, long after our lives had shifted beyond recognition, was too large to grasp. That's when you begin to understand that we're all just renters here, passing through, holding a brief lease on the sky and the ground beneath our feet. And yet the comet itself wasn't the point. It was faint, almost invisible, little more than a blur against the horizon. What mattered was the silence that surrounded it, the stillness of that car pulled to the side of a country road, the sound of the wind, the faint accumulated sounds of insects, the way our breath felt louder than usual. It was the act of leaving behind the familiar glow of town, trading its safety and its certainty for the unknown of the open dark. That same act, stepping away from the known and into the unseen, is written into human history. It's why people once carried torches into forests, why whole communities huddled close to hearths, why stories of what waited in the dark were passed down for centuries. We lived in a time before tracking apps and real-time alerts. News was only broadcast twice a day. People read newspapers and had to make phone calls from a cord that tethered them to the wall. There were no push notifications to confirm the comet's visibility, no augmented overlays to mark its coordinates. Many things relied on such fragile threads then. People could still be strangers, be unreachable, before the world shrank down to the size of a smartphone screen. My father relied on memory, on the news, on word of mouth. When he pointed at the faint streak above the trees, I had no way to verify it. I had to trust him. That trust mattered. The uncertainty was part of the experience. All these years later, I still don't know if we actually glimpsed the comet. In that uncertainty was a kind of wonder. When you couldn't summon the sky on demand, when you couldn't cross-check the cosmos against software in your pocket, you had to look with patience. You had to believe in what you saw, even if it was only a faint impression at the edge of your vision. Wonder thrived in that space where proof was fragile, where imagination was necessary. And that same wonder once filled every generation before us. Astronomers who mapped comets by hand, farmers who trusted the stars for planting, soldiers who prayed for night to cover their movements. All of them lived in that same uncertainty and drew meaning from it. My father believed the night was worth driving into. He believed that what waited in it had value, even if it was hard to see, even if it was fleeting, even if it might have been missed altogether. Today, those spaces of uncertainty are filled with conspiracy and noise, but it wasn't always like that. In that moment, he handed me something larger than a glimpse of a comet. He gave me a philosophy, one known by countless others before us. Darkness isn't just the absence of light. It holds something worth entering. That moment stayed with me. It shaped the way I later stood in abandoned buildings, in forgotten cemeteries, on silent ridgelines, camera in hand. It shaped how I wrote, how I chose stories to tell, and how to tell them. But it also shaped how I came to understand continuity, that my nights belonged to a much older lineage, that to walk into darkness without certainty, without guarantees, is to join a human inheritance. It waits in silence. It waits in ingrained memory. It waits in the willingness to bypass primal survival instincts and surround yourself with the unknown. In Act 2, we move further into the dark. In Act 2, we're going to explore fear, ritual, and history. Memory alone doesn't make a book. Writing Field Guide to the Night meant moving beyond recollection. I had to ask harder questions. How have entire cultures lived with darkness? How'd they fear it? How'd they adapt to it? And in some cases, how did they depend on it for survival? Those questions took me into history, into folklore, into psychology, into the lived record of what the night has meant across centuries, because night is a human inheritance, one that we're in danger of losing, but more on that in Act 3. Every generation before us knew it more intimately than we do. They shaped rituals around it, built defenses against it, and wove stories to explain it. Darkness shaped rhythms of labor and rest, a sense of safety, of faith, and imagination. To trace those threads, I had to enter a larger archive, myths passed to children, wartime blackout manuals, astronomers' journals, superstitions handed down as household rules. What I found was that the night isn't one story, it's a web of stories, layered across time and place, each one teaching something about how people saw themselves when the lights went out. That research changed the project. It stopped being about my personal encounters and became about connections linking people hundreds of years apart to the same stories. How silence in an Adirondack sky connects to silence in a London basement during the Blitz, or to a lullaby sung beside a fire in the hills of Iceland. It's all the same sky, and we're linked by the same ancient origins. The night, I realized, is a shared language, one we're in danger of forgetting. The first fear is darkness itself. Long before language, before tools, before stories, humans recoiled from what they couldn't see. Imagine a cave without fire, a forest without moonlight. The air feels heavier. Every sound seems amplified and mysterious. A snapping twig, the cry of an animal, the shift of leaves in the wind, a knocking in the distance, all of it amplified. The fear of dark isn't irrational. It's an inheritance we can't escape. It's written into us. Those who respected the dark, who paused before stepping into it, lived to pass on their genes. Those who ignored it often didn't. Even today, the body remembers. When power fails and the room drops into sudden blackness, muscles tense before the mind forms a thought. Walk outside at night, a street light flickers out and your chest tightens. Forests hush at dusk, birds go silent, predators stir. Even with locks, alarms, floodlights, the old instinct whispers. That's the paradox. Technology convinces us we're safe, but the instinct never leaves. Cultures built myths around that instinct. In Spain, parents warned children of El Coco, a shapeless being that snatched those who wandered after dark. In Iceland, the midwinter witch Grilla stalked the hills, capturing disobedient children, boiling them alive in her cauldron. Across the Caribbean, tales of the Sukuyan told of a woman who shed her skin, roaming as a ball of fire, slipping through keyholes to drain the life of careless sleepers. These weren't meant to be gentle fairy tales. They were warnings, survival strategies woven into a story. The pill in the applesauce. Keep close to the fire. Stay near the hearth. Don't stray into the cold forest or the open field where predators move unseen. Fear was an education. Darkness became the classroom. It taught boundaries, where you could go and where you couldn't. And it taught obedience, that survival meant listening to elders. Over time, those lessons shaped how societies understood risk itself. Communities built rituals around fear. In medieval Europe, towns established curfews, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. At the ringing of a bell, households doused their hearth flames. The purpose was partly fire prevention, but it also reinforced order. When the bell tolled, the day was done. Darkness was to be respected, the streets left to watchmen and patrols. In Islamic cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, night watchmen known as asase patrolled alleys with lanterns and staffs. They called the hours aloud. It was a reminder that someone was awake, walking a post, that the community was guarded. Chinese cities had similar traditions, watchmen beating clappers or gongs to measure hours through the night, an act of both timekeeping and reassurance, sound carrying through darkness, a signal that the unknown was being kept at bay. Ritual protections carried weight too. In rural Ireland, iron nails hammered above door frames to block spirits. In parts of Africa, ash from sacred fires scattered at thresholds to confuse or repel whatever moved in the dark. Among indigenous peoples of North America, trickster stories and shadow beings paired with rituals of songs and campfire smoke, protective lines drawn around the camp. All revealed the same truth. Night was a boundary to be negotiated. You didn't walk into it carelessly. You found ways in with ritual, with protection, with acknowledgement. It wasn't something to conquer. It was something to live alongside. We like to think of ourselves as rational, as creatures who outgrew myth. Yet shadows still carry meanings we feel even if we can't name them. Horror films still lean on what lurks just outside the frame. Cities still flood streets with light because a darkened block feels unsafe. The instinct persists. The lessons endure. The fear that once saved lives still shapes us even if we don't admit it. But fear of night wasn't always about spirits. In the 20th century, darkness became a defense. Less than a lifetime ago, entire cities dimmed by command. What had once been instinct was enforced by law. During the Second World War, London, Hamburg, Los Angeles, New York, all ordered blackouts. Neon signs went dark, headlights masked with slits, windows painted or draped. In Britain, air raid wardens patrolled with whistles and flashlights, searching for any shred of light that might leak skyward. Light leaking from a curtain could bring a knock on the door or a fine. The goal was simple: erase the map from above. Light meant visibility. Visibility meant risk. Families gathered in kitchens lit only by hooded lamps, weak light pooling on tables, shadows taking the corners, radios hissed low somewhere out of sight. Children learned to identify bombers by sound alone. The deep thrum of a hinkle, the staggered note of Junkers. A new, terrible vocabulary of fear. Every night became a lesson in patience, in silence, in resilience. Across the Atlantic, blackout drills transformed American cities. In 1942, New York, the brightest city on earth, went dark in less than 20 minutes. Curtains drawn tight, office towers blacked out floor by floor, the skyline vanished. Taxi drivers crept through intersections, headlights slitted. Pedestrians groped along sidewalks, guided by habit and muscle memory. And then suddenly, lights back on. The city roared to life. The drill ended, but the memory stayed. It showed how quickly people could adapt when survival was at stake. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships silhouetted against America's glowing coast. Boardwalks and seaside hotels lit up their targets. Sailors could be killed because cities refused to burn too bright. Pressure mounted until compliance came. When bulbs finally went dark, the ocean grew harder to navigate. Lives were spared. Darkness became an armor, a camouflage. Darkness shielded ships. It sheltered cities. It restored for a time the knowledge that night could protect. The same instinct that kept children near the hearth now kept nations alive. And yet those years gave people something unexpected. With lights extinguished, the stars returned. For the first time in generations, the Milky Way stretched across London. Orion stood over rooftops in Paris. In New York and Chicago, constellations once drowned in sky glow reappeared. People remembered what it meant to look up and feel small, to feel connected to something beyond themselves. The blackout stripped life of noise. Families spent time together by candlelight. Neighbors gathered in basements telling stories to pass the time. For many, intimacy grew in the dark. Strangers brushed hands on unlit streets, steadying one another. People listened differently, noticed more. Some remembered the quiet more than the bombs. Oral histories tell of people who later missed the stillness. They found post-war neon harsh, unsettling. They spoke of the blackouts as a time when life slowed, when stars came back, when neighbors knew each other a little better. The war took much, but in the dark, something was briefly returned, and the blackouts lived on in subtle ways inherited through routine. As I researched these histories, I saw how closely they echoed my personal memory. Darkness wasn't just mine. It was cultural, historical, collective. It linked people across centuries, across continents, through shared recognition of what it means to live without light. That realization gave Field Guide to the Night its structure. The book couldn't stay a series of isolated vignettes. It needed a thread through them all, a bridge between memory and history. Each chapter built on the idea that darkness we encounter is never ours alone. It's shared. It carries echoes of every generation that faced it. Suddenly, the comet and the blackout, and the myth of the Sukuyan and the legends parents told children to keep them safe belonged to the same landscape. Not separate anecdotes, chapters in the same story. One that stretched from ancient myth to modern blackout curtains. Field Guide to the Night became less a memoir and more a map of how humanity has lived with darkness, where personal story and historical record overlap, sometimes perfectly, sometimes uneasily, always with resonance. By the mid-20th century, the meaning of darkness shifted again. For most of history, night was something to fear, something to endure, or something to conceal ourselves within. Darkness shielded against predators. It cloaked soldiers during the Blitz. It was a curtain across the home. But the Cold War changed the lesson. Night became a field to monitor, to measure, to surveil. Predators no longer prowled forests. Enemies traveled at 30,000 feet. To live in the mid-20th century was to learn the absence of light couldn't be trusted. Night had to be watched. The landscape filled with watch posts. Radar domes rose like half-buried planets along ridgelines and shores. Arctic stations embedded in the ice, a chain of outposts across the top of the world. In between, ordinary citizens became watchers of the night, farmers, teachers, teenagers, binoculars pressed to their eyes. The aircraft warning service trained them to read silhouettes against the stars. They memorized the shapes of friend and foe, kept logbooks, phoned in reports to regional centers. The night wasn't just a backdrop anymore. The first sign of attack might be a speck of shadow crossing the moon. Above it all, machines multiplied the human eye. Radar, satellites, listening posts. The electronic senses of NORAD cut through the blackness. What had been an expanse of stars became a grid to be monitored, a frontier to be mapped and defended. The blackout gave way to surveillance, concealment replaced by vigilance. Instead of covering lights to hide from bombs, nations lit control rooms with red lights and radar blips, watching the night for anything that moved. They reminded me that watching the night isn't only a memory, but also a practice still alive in the present. Every blackout, every moment of silence when the grid fails, brings back a piece of that inheritance. But those moments are growing rarer. The habit of paying attention depends on having darkness to attend to. And that's where the danger lies today. Because the night we've inherited, the one that held our myths, our fears, our stories, and our patience, is slipping away. That's where we go in Act 3. In Act 3, we're going to explore the practice of observation. If you've read the book already, you know how these threads come together. If you haven't, I hope this episode gives you a sense of the journey inside its pages. By the middle of the 20th century, darkness had already been studied, mapped, and feared in countless ways. But what stayed with me was the human act of paying attention. That practice of watching the night sky has always been with us. It's about what happens when you look long enough into the dark and let it teach you how to notice. I found myself thinking about that as I worked. Writing Field Guide to the Night became a form of noticing. Long hours in archives, searching in forgotten collections, waiting for connections to emerge. At first, I thought the work would be modest, a slim volume of reflections and photographs, something that could be finished quickly. Instead, it became something closer to a long, broken night shift. Writing tests your patience. You write a passage, cross it out, write it again. You notice what you didn't notice before. That's the discipline of editing. It feels like pacing a hallway or listening in a dark forest, ears straining for any information. You don't always know what matters until later, but you keep your attention steady. Sometimes the meaning comes only after you've stared at a page for hours. Other times it appears when you set it aside, let it be for a while. I came to love that process. Early morning revisions. The frustration of cutting passages I cared about, only to see the book grow stronger without them. The satisfaction of finding the rhythm in a paragraph, of hearing a cadence settle onto the page like a pattern in music. That's what this process gave me. Not only stories of the night, but a way of living inside them while I wrote. When the book finally reached readers, the circle widened. And this was the part I hadn't expected. Messages began to arrive from people who saw their own lives in its pages. One wrote about a childhood memory during the 1977 blackout, how her family gathered around a single candle and listened to the city sound different without electricity. Another described an uncle who worked night shifts at a mill, stepping outside at 3 a.m. to smoke a cigarette under the stars, and the stories he would tell her years later about living in the night and sleeping the day away while the world moved on. Someone else told me about a power outage in the Adirondacks when neighbors who rarely spoke ended up sharing soup and bread around a wood stove. These weren't my stories. They belonged to others. But they fit into the same archive, the same continuity of how people encounter the night. It showed me that the book wasn't an ending. It was an opening, a place where all the stories, all the things that orbited Restoration Obscura could meet. And maybe that's what matters most. The recognition that darkness has never been private property. It belongs to all of us, to the families who told stories by lamplight, to the workers who kept shifts in factories or fields, to the children who lay awake watching headlights paint their ceilings, the insomniacs and the poets, and those who just seek a quieter version of the world. We inherit the night together. We interpret it in different ways, but we share the same instinct to give it meaning. What we're in danger of losing, that inheritance is fragile, because today, in most places, we're losing the dark. Sky glow spreads over our cities and towns, billions of streetlights, billboards, parking lots, and screens bleed light into the atmosphere. The stars vanish, replaced by a dull orange haze. For the first time in human history, children are growing up without a view of the Milky Way. They will never know the shock of seeing that river of light stretch across a truly dark sky. What was once universal has become rare, confined to remote deserts, national parks, or the middle of oceans. And with that loss comes more than missed beauty. It changes ecosystems. Birds migrate off course. Sea turtles hatch and crawl toward highways instead of the sea. Nocturnal animals lose their hunting grounds. Plants bloom at the wrong times. The balance that evolved with darkness falters when the dark itself disappears. Fireflies, once common in summer fields, now vanish from whole counties. They depend on darkness to see one another's signals. In landscapes awash with artificial light, their courtship flickers fade. Children who once chased them with jars now grow up without ever seeing that glow. The loss is quiet, but it erases so much more than the details in the night sky. And then there's the windshield effect. Ask anyone who drove long distances a generation ago. At the end of a trip, your windshield, headlights, and grille were splattered with insects. It was messy, unavoidable, a fact of travel. Today, that doesn't happen. You can drive hundreds of miles and return with glass nearly clean. The insects are gone, their numbers collapsing under pesticides, habitat loss, and the unbroken glare of light pollution. This is the simplest evidence that we're changing the world with excess light. What disappears from the windshield also disappears from the food chain. Fewer insects mean fewer birds, fewer bats, and fewer pollinators. And it means fewer chances for us to see with our own eyes how alive the night once was. It changes us too. Artificial light interrupts our sleep, alters our hormones, erodes the circadian rhythms that once tied us to the turning of the earth. And it reshapes culture. Without the stars, we lose a language our ancestors spoke fluently. A sky once crowded with gods, stories, and guides is replaced by a blank ceiling. This is not an abstract loss. It's happening now. In New York City, only the brightest planets pierce the haze. In the capital region, the dome of Albany's light swallows the horizon for miles. Even in rural towns, security lights keep the night at bay. So the question is, what happens when stars are gone? When the watchers of the night have nothing left to see? If we let the dark vanish, we lose more than stars. We lose the archive of attention itself. That's the call in front of us, to preserve the night as we would an inheritance, to shield our lights, dim our skylines, and remember that the dark has value, because without it, we risk forgetting who we are when the lights go out, and that would be a shame. Beyond the first book, more books are underway, each tracing different histories of silence, memory, and forgotten landscapes. And a fourth book is already in progress, a first step into fiction. Even there, the themes remain: secrecy, erasure, the ways that the past is a ghost in the present. What began as a single field guide is becoming a small library of exploration. To step into darkness is to join that archive with the watchers, the storytellers, the neighbors gathered around stoves trading stories, the families talking by low light, the wanderers who looked up and wondered, and the poets and dreamers in search of a quieter version of the world. That's the heart of Field Guide to the Night. I want to thank everyone who's read the book, shared their reflections, or simply taken the time to sit with its pages. The response has been humbling, and it's reminded me that these stories matter. If you haven't yet, Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in print and Kindle editions on Amazon. Thank you for joining me for another season of Hidden History. This has been Season 2, Episode 7 of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm John Bulmer. Thank you for listening, and thanks for keeping watch with me. Until next time, take care. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the legends of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light together. I'm excited to share that my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, is now available. This project grew out of the same work you hear on this podcast. It's an immersive history of how night has shaped human experience, from the first sky watchers and their constellations, to the wartime blackouts that changed daily life, to the hidden surveillance networks of the Cold War. It's part cultural history, part personal journey, and it invites us to step beyond today's artificial glow and rediscover what still lives in the shadows. Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. If you believe history is worth preserving, if you've ever paused at the ruins of an old mill or held a faded photograph and wondered about the world it came from, this space is for you. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast streams on all major platforms. Subscribe to support independent, reader-funded storytelling at restorationobscura.com. Copyright 2025, John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura. All rights reserved. Restoration Obscura explores forgotten places and overlooked histories. Visiting abandoned sites can be dangerous, unstable, and often illegal. This podcast does not encourage or endorse trespassing, vandalism, or unsafe exploration. Please respect property laws, community safety, and historic preservation efforts. Restoration Obscura draws on a range of materials, including public archives, institutional holdings, and privately preserved collections. Many images and documents have uncertain or incomplete provenance. When possible, sources are identified and credited. While we work to preserve and interpret these materials with care, not all rights of ownership reside with Restoration Obscura. All information is verified as accurate at the time of publication.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.